Well, good morning. Anybody been watching the Olympics? Am I the only one? I love watching the Olympics. I love watching the sports in that. There's one sport that if this continues, there's a sport called rowing that we're all going to have to get better at. And I think we're going to have to figure out how to make cars into boats and row out of here. I've been watching it this time with my daughter for the first time, the Olympics. And it's like through a whole nother lens. When you watch it for the first time and when you watch it with kids and they're like, so what's happening here? And the first sport we chose was probably not the best sport for kids. Like it was water polo. And it was just on early in the morning and she was like, what's this? And I was like, I actually don't know. I really couldn't explain this to you at all. And we tried watching that, but we've been trying to watch the Olympics together. And I mean, it really is an amazing thing, isn't it? Watching like these games happen and watching people come together from different countries and compete. And even though like there's wars going on and with some of these countries themselves, they'll come together and compete in one place. And so we were watching it and I told Jane everything I understood about it. She was like, so Dad, what happens? And I was like, well, all these countries come together and they compete to see who's the best at everything, at every sport we can think of. And she was like, okay, and how do they know who's the best? And I was like, well, some of them are faster than others. Like you watch swimming and you can tell this person's faster than the other swimmers, which is really intimidating when you watch it through a kid's eyes and you see like this person who touched the wall and the next person touches the wall like right after them. And it's like so fast, like now to now, like it's like that fast. Like if you're like time, it'd be like one person's like now and the other one's like now. It's like now. And like if you go from like now, like the first now is like a person who's like on the medal stand. The second now, never heard of him. We don't know who that guy is. Like now. Like these people have trained their entire lives. They've spent all this time, all this energy. They've not like eaten a single fatty food for like 20 years. They've like exercised every single day. And now to now is all that we're known for. Is like this little tiny gap of things. I also know two other things about sports. I know that if a gymnast hops, that's bad. If they don't land it clean, if they hop, that's what I told Jane, that's bad. That's all I know. I don't know why it's bad, but it's bad apparently. I also learned last night that if they bend their elbows while they're on the high bars, that's bad. And I knew when they did it because the announcer would say it. And I was like, see, that was bad. If you just turn up the volume, you'll know a lot about this sport. Pretty much everything there is to know. I also know if divers make a big splash, that's bad. Don't make big splashes. Just don't do that. So that's what I know about the Olympics. I was trying to teach Jane everything I knew, and that was all. That was all I had for the Olympics. There was those things. And I'm watching it, and there was this phrase that they kept using when people would do these amazing things. They kept using this phrase over and over and over again. And they would say, you're watching history being made. It's not like setting a world record, or if they were, if there was like somebody from a new country or a different country that had won something. One of the guys last night won a swimming event, and he was the first one from Japan ever to win that swimming event, to get the gold in that. And they're like, you're watching history being made. And I was like, that's right, I'm watching history being made. And like that sounds really intense and really impressive, but that's on a macro scale and like on a national scale, and on an international scale, but the truth is on an individual level, you're making history every single day too. It may not be as impressive, we may not be like as big a deal in our history making, but we're making history every single day too. Every day you're making decisions, every day you're making choices, every day you're doing actions from those choices, and every single time you do those, you're making some sort of history. You're making some sort of decision or action that leaves something in its wake. And ultimately, you're making some sort of history too. We all are every single day. Now, it could be a good history. It could be a bad history. But there's something you're doing that is happening every single day where you're making a story that you're writing yourself. And the question is, what is that story? I think we think about this from time to time. What are those things that we're writing? What are those things we're doing where we're making history? Are they great? Are they bad? Maybe it's in your business where you think about that, in your job. Maybe there's a legacy you want to leave behind in that sounds really impressive. Maybe there's something there that you want to do. Maybe there's a lineage or a history that you want to leave in your family of a story that you want passed down about you. We have those things in our lives all the time, that we want the history to be made. We want the story to be written that's really an impressive story, a really great story. And I want to look today at a story in this Acts that we've been walking through in this grassroots gospel, where we don't see, again, we see in Acts, we see this big picture, this macro level of the gospel spreading and the church starting, and this huge picture of the church starting. But what we miss sometimes is that happens with individuals. It's not just like big moments only. There are a lot of moments where the kingdom is spread from individual to individual. And I will look at one of those stories today where it's just an individual to individual. And it's in Acts chapter 9. And this is a story that we could fly by really quickly. But there's just a couple lines that hit me really hard when I was reading it. And it's a story about a lady. Her name is Dorcas. And that's not a great start to a story. Her name is Dorcas. She also has a Greek name, which is Tabitha. And for some reason, she chose to go by Tabitha. I don't know why. Seems like Dorcas was fitting. It was fine. I don't see what was wrong with that. We had a friend one time. He was telling us about a girl he graduated high school with, and her name was Krista, and she would only go by Krista. She never wanted to be called anything else. Her name was Krista, and she wanted to be called Krista, and her last name was Lear. And through all of high school, she never told anybody her middle name. She never wanted to have people know her real name. So she was Krista Lear, and that was what she was always known as. And the day of graduation came, and it was the first time where they announced from the stage her full name. And her parents had named her Crystal Shanda Lear. Like, when you have the last name Lear to start with, you have to do some work to be like, how do we make this so creative? You have to do a lot of work to get Crystal and Shanda in there to make Lear work. But they had done the homework. They had done their part. They had made her name interesting. And for some reason, she only wanted to be known as Krista. It's kind of like this Dorcas. I don't blame her for being like, just call me Tabitha. It's cool. So Tabitha is this woman, and there's this line in Acts chapter 9 that is so great about her, and it sums her up in really one quick sentence. It says this: in Joppa, there was a disciple named Tabitha. In Greek, her name is Dorcas, but she'll go by Tabitha. And she was always doing good and helping the poor. Look at that line by itself. Like, if you just had one line to describe somebody, you get one sentence to describe somebody, I would say Tabitha did a pretty good job. If you were to think about it right now, and you were to say, my life, my entire life, who I am, my personality, my character, if it was summed up, my story was summed up in one sentence, what would your sentence say? What do you think somebody would write about you if they had one sentence to describe you? I mean, she doesn't know this is going to go in a book. She doesn't know that this is going to be recorded for the rest of history for people to read about her. She didn't know this at the time, but it's a pretty good sentence, isn't it? There are worse things to being known for. In fact, it says that she was always doing good. In fact, that sentence, if you were to read it in the Greek translation, it actually says that she was full of good works. She was full of good works. Like, she almost couldn't help herself. She was so full of good works that almost if she tried to do bad works, she just couldn't do them because she was full of good works. There was no room for other things. She was full of good works. That's a pretty good sentence. What would people say about you? What would your kids, what would your family members, what would your coworkers, what would they say about you if they had one sentence to describe you? This is a pretty good one. See, our reputation is a big deal. Our story becomes a big deal. And if our story was summed up in one sentence, what would our story say? Would our story be this concise? Would it be this good? If you'll give me just a second, indulge me, because I want to brag just for a second about the church right now. I'm going to take a tangent and look at this again on a macro level. We'll talk about this individually too. But one of the things that I loved was this last week I had 2 different encounters that were just amazing about what's happening here. And you know, the truth is, like, we think of our reputation sometimes as this thing that lingers behind us, but we all know too that our reputation is something that precedes us too. It's the thing that people already know about us, and they identify us by that. It doesn't linger behind us. It usually is actually in front of us. And it's what people know about us before anything else. And there were 2 moments. One was the Verizon Event Center. which is up in Newport Richey. It's where we went for Summerfest. And Annie and Janessa and I went to this thing called Summerfest, and they do this vendor thing. It's where we met Joel and Betty Ann, was at this thing called Summerfest. And Summerfest was a vendor expo. It was mostly for people who were selling things. We were just there to sell Jesus. And so we were hanging out in our little booth and doing our thing. And we were doing the things of meeting everybody and getting to know people, vendors and people who were there to see things. There was a car show outside. There was all this stuff going on. So we were just there for that day. We got a call from the Verizon Event Center that hosted that. And they said, could we meet with somebody from Restoration? And so I went to this meeting on Wednesday. And on Wednesday morning, I got to this meeting. And I basically walk in. And they're like, have a seat. And when you say have a seat in an event center, it's kind of hard to find just one. You're like, okay, just anywhere? Or, okay, so I sat down in this seat, and we sat down. They were like, can we get you coffee? They came and sat with me. And two of the people there, Jeff and Nikki, they sat down with me, and they were like, hey, we want to talk to you about partnering with you guys. Now, here's the thing that's interesting, is the Verizon Event Center already has a church that had met in there for a number of years, actually. So they knew another church. There was another church that one of their guys already went to. In fact, the guy who's talking to me goes to another church. And they said, we really want to talk to you guys about partnering with you. They said, we think this would be good for us. And they said, here's what the guy said. I love this. He said, because here's what we see with you guys. You seem like a church who wants to go meet people where they are. I was like have you been sitting in my groffice? Listening to what we talk about in the groffice? By the way, that's my garage. It's also an office, if you don't know about the groffice. I mean, I was like, how did you know that? You took the words out of my mouth. Yes, that's exactly what we want to be. And he was like, we've noticed that with you guys. And he said, we actually would love to help you with that because we think you could help us with that. There's a part of it where he said, I believe at least, he said, we believe in this thing called marketplace ministry, where you can do ministry in the marketplace. And he said, we would love to have you guys come be greeters and be people who know about events. And basically, you just show up. You can wear your orange restoration shirts. You can be wherever you want. And basically, when people have questions about events, they come to you guys. And we'll say, go see the people in orange restoration shirts. They'll tell you about this event. And I was thinking, that's awesome. Because instead of us having to put on a car show, they can put on the car show. We just go meet all the people. Right? I was thinking, that is a win-win. I love that, We just show up and be the nice people. But he noticed something about us, that the reputation was there. The story had been written, and he had caught this version of the story in his own mind. I loved that. Thought that was huge. And actually, one of the other ones, okay, this one's a little creepier. I'm just going to warn you. We were on Facebook, and we get alerts whenever things on Facebook happen, okay? So, we get to see, if something happens to the restoration page, if we're mentioned somewhere, whatever, we see that. And there was a conversation that took place on Facebook. It was two people who have never been here, but they had this conversation. And we got to be those Facebook stalkers who get to see all of it. And I'm not going to use real names, but let's just say there's a gal named Sally. And Sally, not her real name, she puts on Facebook, hey, Facebook or FB, family and friends, looking for a good family church, any recommendations? Now, a friend of Sally's, and we're just going to call her Friend of Sally writes in there, and Friend of Sally is a person who had come to the free family photos. Now, she's never been here on a Sunday. She's just come to the free family photos, and that's her only interaction with us. She says back, do you prefer a large congregation or intimate congregation? I like that she uses really nice words about being small. Or intimate. Friend of Sally has tact. And then Friend of Sally says, there is a new small church called Restoration Church in Trinity that I was interested in checking out. So Sally writes back and says, I just want a church that's not judgmental, really works to help the community, and delivers positive messages. Friend of Sally says back to Sally, that is good, smiley face. The one above has a website you can check out for a little more info. And she said this, it is new and still very small. I like that they meet people where they are and focus on community, as you said. That's awesome. That's amazing, right? Friend of Sally gets it, You know? The reputation's out there. The reputation precedes us. These are things that our story, if it was summed up in one sentence, those aren't bad stories to have written about us. If you know anything about Restoration, that's what we want to be, is not a community church, but a church in the community. And that if we could sum up ourselves in one story, those are not bad stories to write. And that's on a big level, that's on a grand level, that's something that I'm very proud of with us right now where we're at. But I look at it on the smaller level, and in your life, in your family, if you had one line to sum up your story, what would it be? How would the things that you act out, how would those be remembered? I was this week on Monday, does anybody know about this free bowling thing with your kids? Like if you have little kids, you can take them bowling for free in the summer. And you still have to rent shoes and stuff. And so I'm just thinking about just buying our kids bowling shoes, and they'll be those kids. But we went bowling, and it was just me and Jane and Oliver. And Oliver, my son, he is a boy, and he is all boy. And if there's a button, he just has to push the button. Like, he cannot help himself. You can see him. You can literally see it, like the wheels turning in his head. Like, there's a button, and button. I mean, you can see it. He has no poker face. You can see all of it happening in his little brain. And so I'm bowling, and and so we were taking turns, and they wanted me to bowl as well. So I would take the little ramp away, and I'd put it to the side, and I would go bowl. And I did put down the bumpers, everybody. Okay, they went down, and so I went to go bowl, and I went up, and I was trying this spin thing that Austin Fry's been teaching me about how to spin the ball down the lane like a pro, and I'm getting pretty close to being a professional. Like, I'm inches. I mean, it's really good. So I'm going up. I'm really proud of myself. I have the ball, and I go to do the spin thing, and it happens, and it's perfect. I mean, it's like right on line. You can see it's just curving right towards that middle pin. And right as it goes to the middle pin, the guard comes down, the ball bounces off the guard and into the gutter. And I turn around, and I look around, and Oliver's not near the button. He's like over, he's like looking around. Right? And I turn around, I'm like, what happened? And so I give him the benefit of the doubt. I'm like, okay, so I think now the ball is in the gutter, but I'm like, I'm going to go ahead and roll another one, So I look over at him. I hit the reset button because I have to go again. So take the ball. I do my perfect spin. And again, it is right on line. I mean, perfect, right down the middle. And right as it goes to hit that middle pin, the bumper comes down, and the ball bounces out into the gutter one more time. And I look over at the guy next to me who's in the lane next to me, and he's like... and there's Oliver, and he stands there, and he has this reflex where immediately he goes like this. And I looked at him, I was like, dude, what is the deal? He did this. He backed up. And he looked so terrified in that moment, and he should have been, mostly because he messed up my score. And then the bumpers that on the sides, they came up for Jane to go next, and they come up, and the balls get wedged in the sides, and I have to be that guy who's like, hey, can I get some help? I need somebody to walk down there and get my balls. They're stuck in the gutter. I have to be that guy. I'm like the biggest loser at the bowling alley. And so, but I looked at Oliver, and I was like, dude, you can't do that. And I'm like kind of in his face, and I'm kind of mad because he hit the button twice. And I was so mad, and I look at his little face as he does this, and you have that moment, ever had this moment, especially as a parent, where something hits you, and you're like, is this what they're going to remember? Is this what they're going to remember? If they think about bowling with Dad, is this the moment he's going to remember? Not the times I'm lugging the stupid ramp back and forth for him. Not the times where I'm cheering for him or he's jumping up and down or I'm telling him like, hey, don't step across the line, not because you're going to get a foot fault, because you're going to slide down the lane. He doesn't remember those moments. What if this is all he remembers, is the time that Dad yelled at him about the button? Do you ever have these moments where it's terrifying as a parent? It's like terrifying. You're like, is this where I messed them up forever? And you wonder if that's the story they're going to remember. If that's the story that's going to be written about you, right? It's concerning. It's like it's a terrifying prospect if that's the story they remember about you. And I think that in that moment, we get really hung up on this. And what hit me is, what is he going to remember about Dad? Is it going to be Dad's too competitive? that Dad was too hard on me? Is he going to just remember that, like, Dad was kind of joking around with me about this? Is he going to remember, like, the traits about Dad in this moment? What are the traits he's going to think of? And the values that I'm exhibiting when I do that. What are those traits? What are those values that I'm going to have, that I'm going to exhibit to him? And I think the realization I had is that the values that you live out will be the values that outlive you. The values I live out in front of my son will be the values that outlive me. They'll be the values that go on from the next generation to the next generation to the next generation. The values that you live out will be the values that outlive you. And this woman, Dorcas / Tabitha, she gets that. She gets it. Because actually in this moment, she's passed away. She's no longer alive when these words are written about her. It says that she had died. The next verse says this: about that time, while she was doing good and helping the poor, she became sick and she died. And her body was washed and placed in an upstairs room. So people cared about her. They washed her body. They placed her in an upstairs room. And Lydda, which is where Peter was at the time, if you remember last week, we kind of talked about that. Sorry, I don't know what that's coming from. But last week, we kind of talked about that with Peter. And he was in this place called Lydda, where he healed Aeneas and that whole story of the crippled man. He was in Lydda and was near Joppa. So he went with them to Joppa with the disciples. And when they heard that Peter was in Lydda, they sent 2 men to him and urged him, please come at once. So she's passed away. She's no longer there. And Peter went with them. And when he arrived, he was taken upstairs to the room where her body was laying. All the widows stood around him, crying and showing him the robes and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was still with them. Now, this is a powerful moment right here. Imagine this. I mean, I've done my fair share of like hospital visits and visits with grieving families. And you have this moment so often where you go into a room and they'll show you the things that made up what that person's life was about. And can you imagine this? Because here's what she had done. This woman, she had found these widows. And in this day and age, widows were not like they are today. Widows were in a completely other place where they had no husband, they had no job, they could not have a job, they could not provide for themselves. They were the furthest outcast of the outcasts at the time. And she found these widows who had nothing, and what did she do for them? She started making them clothing. She started caring for those widows. And they couldn't help themselves when Peter shows up. They show him, look what she did for us. Look what she made for us. She made us these things. See, she understood, Tabitha understood that there was a part of her where she had to get involved as a disciple. She started working and she started being an evangelist. She started being this evangelist, but not with her words, but with her hands. And she was like, what can I do? How can I meet people where they are? And so the value that she displayed was that she went in and she did something tangible for these widows that had no other way to do this. I think so many times we get hung up on evangelists or people who are supposed to do great things in their community. We think that they're like speakers. We think they're extroverts. We think they're the people who go out and they preach big sermons or they talk to lots of people. And that's how you reach your community. That's how you make an impact. That's the value you share. That's not how it works. I would say the best evangelists are not speakers, but they're listeners. They're people who go into a community and listen for, what do you need from us? Do you need school supplies? We can do school supplies. But they don't kick down doors and say, here's what we're going to bring you. Here's what we're going to do for you. And they don't start there. They start with listening first. Say, how do we meet you where you are? See, I think so many times we think that speakers are the best evangelists. I think listeners really are. And I've seen it time and again. And I think the thing she did tangibly is such an important thing. She went with what she knew. Apparently, Tabitha already knew how to sew. She used a skill she already had, and she made these robes and these clothes for these women. I was one time in in Mexico with some students I had taken there. And we were in Mexico for about a week. We were building houses and doing these different things. And it was a great week. I took all these high school students, and I had this one high school student, and he had gone to college, to like a technical college, while he was like dual enrolled between high school and college, and he'd learned how to weld. So we got to Mexico, and they had this playground that they had not been able to assemble because they didn't have a welder. And me, being the smart youth pastor I was like, yeah, go weld, kid. We're in a foreign country. It'll be fine. You're 18, right? Legally, you're an adult. This is on you now. Yeah, now that I look back, that may not have been my best decision. But I was like, yeah, go weld that playground together. And I remember we welded, he put this whole playground together, and he spent his whole week doing that while we built the house. And when the playground was finished, there were families from all over that came to this playground and started playing like instantly. It was like, he finished the last piece. It was like a movie. He like put the last piece together, and all of a sudden it was like, go for it. And everybody just like ran and started playing on the playground. It was awesome. And we started talking about that night, and I said, here's the deal, guys. Here's what we have to understand is if I came down here, and let's say I brought a microphone or even a guitar, and I was like, I'm going to put on the best worship service I can, and I'm going to preach a real good sermon in Spanish, that'd be a miracle. If I did that, though, I was like, I'm going to do that, okay? Like, how many people would I reach? How well would I reach my community? Probably not super well. But there's a dude who's a welder who's 18 years old. He used what he knew how to do. How well did he do reaching his community? He far outreached what I could have done. That's what Dorcas understood. She understood this thing where she could come in and she could say, here's what I have to give. And she offered this small thing, and it became her story. It was the physical thing left behind when she died that they were going, look at this. Look what she did. This was her story she left behind. So Peter, he goes to her, and it says this, he sent them all out of the room, all the widows, and he got down on his knees and he prayed. And turning toward the dead woman, he said, Tabitha, get up. He uses her Greek name. He says, Tabitha, get up. Now, this may just be interesting to me, but again, we looked at this a little bit last week. And last week we looked at how Peter was almost mimicking what Jesus had said. When Jesus had healed a lame man, Peter says almost word for word what Jesus had said. And that happens again right here. Peter's not coming up with original words here. He's using word for word what Jesus said. It happens in Mark chapter 5, and if you'll indulge me for just a second, because this may only be interesting to me, but I find it really interesting that he uses these exact words. It says this in Mark 5. This exact scenario happens. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep. There's a girl who's not dead, but she's asleep, and then they laughed at him. And I don't know if they thought Jesus was like being funny, like, oh, Jesus, you and your jokes about dead people, you know? And it says, after he put them all out, he does the same thing. He sends them all out of the room, just like Peter, right? And you got to think Peter's mimicking this exact scenario. He sends them all out of the room. He took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha Kaum, which means little girl, I say to you, get up. Do you see the similarity there just for a second? Talitha Kaum. In fact, Kaum is exactly what Peter says. When he says get up, he says to her, not Talitha Kaum, he says Tabitha Kaum. Tabitha Kaum. It's not even the same words. It's not even like similar words. It's actually like one letter different. He doesn't say Talitha Kaum, he says Tabitha Kaum. And he says, Tabitha, get up. And just like Jesus did, Talitha Kaum, which means little girl, I say to you, get up. And immediately the little girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. I don't know why that's important, but it's in there. At this, they were completely astonished. He says almost word for word what Jesus said. almost word for word. And this is just a quick side note, but I think sometimes we get so thinking that like we have to make like church fancy, or we have to make like our words to our community fancy, or we have to like find some other way to package things so that it looks really cool, or try to find a new way to put a new wineskin on an old wine type of thing. And I think there's sometimes where what Peter's showing there is you don't have to do that, is that it works if you just use Jesus' words sometimes. Have you ever had that moment where you've seen like somebody with like a tattoo or had a bumper sticker where you're like, hey, I recognize that phrase because it comes from the Bible, and like people don't even know it? There's sometimes where I don't think we have to reinvent the wheel. And Peter's doing that. He's not reinventing the wheel. He's literally saying almost word for word, almost down to one letter, the exact same words Jesus said, and they still have the same power. And he says this, Talitha, Kaum, Tabitha, get up. She opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He took her by the hand and helped her to her feet. Then he called for the believers, especially the widows, and presented her to them alive. And Peter raises her from the dead in Jesus' name. Using Jesus' words, he raises her from the dead, which is spectacular, which is an amazing story. But the amazing thing about Tabitha's life is that even if she wasn't revived, she would have continued to live. Her values, her story would have continued to live through the women around her. Even if she wasn't revived, she would have lived on. Because the values that you live out will be the values that outlive you. I don't know what that looks like in your life. I don't know the things that you think you could do, or the things you would change, or the things that you would maybe continue to do if you were to write your story as a one-sentence story today. I don't know what that would look like for you. I don't know if there's things that you would do different, or you'd literally go, I would just do this thing more, the thing I'm already doing more. But what are those things in your life? What are those things where your values that you're living out would be values that you would want to outlive you? That you would want to go on and on and on? What would be your one-sentence story? It may not be a bad exercise to write that down now. Say, this is the one-sentence story I want to be said about me, and how do I get there? But I think if we do these things, if we do these values, not just as individuals, but collectively as a church, it's amazing the dividends that it has in the kingdom perspective. That those values will outlive us because they're the values we live out. Let's pray together. God, I thank you so much for this morning. God, I thank you for a woman like Tabitha. I thank you for the people that have been in my life and the people who have been in our lives who have been in this exact spot for us, where they've come through for us, where they've done amazing things for us. And God, we all have somebody who's been generous with us at some point. Thank you for people who are willing to look out for those that nobody else is looking out for. God, I just pray that as a group and as individuals, God, we would be people who are writing just an incredible story. We're just writing this phenomenal sentence that would just be so powerful that if we read it even later on, and if our kids read it, if our grandkids read it, they would be like, yes, that's the story. Those are the values that we still hold because of that person. So God, I pray today, whatever it is we need to change, whatever it is that we need to have impacted in our lives, God, that you would do that. The things that maybe we need to continue to do, you would reinforce those things, and the things we need to get rid of, you would allow us to get rid of those things so that we can write the story that you want us to write. So God, I pray that during this time, as we respond, as we reflect, that you would just speak to us about what those things are. Praise in your name. Amen.